Thank you so much. I'll just see if I can share the screen and get started. Okay.
Sorry.
While I'm sharing and speaking, I may not see you. So if you need to get my attention, please feel free to cut me off. I am not offended at all. Okay, so Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. So I also would like to begin by an acknowledgement that today, where I am on this northern part of Turtle Island, it's part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that I am grateful for the first people of this land who shared and welcomed us. And this land that is land of our Creator, I see this as our responsibility to care for and to welcome those who will come after us. And for me as a Muslim, personally, I know that actions are by intentions, and acknowledging the territories on which I work, live, and celebrate is a necessary step for me towards honoring the original occupants of Turtle Island. And I recognize that there is systemic and institutional systems of power that have oppressed the indigenous peoples of this land. And as part of my faith, to serve all of humanity and creation, and to stand for truth and justice and address inequalities, I see this as something that is important for me to stand with a sincere concern for people around me. And so I hope to walk with those around me in this journey of healing and support in their efforts to claim justice together. I'm really excited to be here to talk about kind of a higher level conversation around decolonizing the water narrative within the Islamic framework. And so my hope is to talk a little bit about contextualizing the water narrative in the Islamic framework and the worldview, Islamic worldview, talk about water and development of the Islamic civilization, Islamic teachings and water, how they're connected, do a quick overview of a case of the Nile of the Aswan Dam, and then relate this back to the water crisis in Muslim majority countries today, and what imagining a path forward can potentially look like based on at least some of the conversations that I've been involved with. So to start with this water narrative and situate it within the Islamic worldview, there are 3 verses of the Quran that kind of came forth. And perhaps you've talked about these verses throughout the conversations already today. So in one verse, in chapter 21, verse 30, it says, as translated, "We made from water every living thing." And then in chapter 6, verse 99, it says, as translated, "It is he who sends down water from the sky and brings forth with it every kind of growing thing." Now, connecting these narratives of water and so many other verses of the Quran that talk about water with a purpose, in chapter 51, verse 56 of the Quran, it's translated as, "The purpose of humankind, I have only created jinns and humankind that they may serve or worship me." So how does this connect to the Islamic worldview and, this integrative form of worship? Dr. Jamal Badawi, when he talks about the Islamic worldview as being a prime motive for development, he talks about this fact that, worship of Allah is not just, the performance of certain rites or devotional acts, but it is much more comprehensive. And really, there are only 2 fundamental conditions to any act having the potential to be an act of worship: that it is done with pure intention, and that it is done within the limits prescribed by Allah. And so then that leaves everything to be quite broad without the compartmentalization of various aspects of human living. And so life is really seen as an integrated and interrelated whole. And so the challenge for humanity becomes to relate and harmonize all life activities under that divine guidance. And so with this kind of Islamic worldview, any form of work is not only a means of survival, but also potentially a rewardable act of worship. And so then when we look at that, and then we look at the development of the Islamic civilization throughout history, there are a couple of different kind of views on the development that happened throughout, I would say, about the 8th to the 12th century or so. And so there is this traditionalist views where people such as Bertrand Russell talk about that Islamic developments may be admirable in some technical ways, but that they actually still required more intellectual energy. Then you have a revisionist view of the development of the Islamic civilization, such as Hobson, Salam, and Saliba have talked about, where they say that, there was, in fact, a Muslim scientific revolution that occurred during the Middle Ages. And then you have people like Briffaut, who, as well as Tenney, who talk about, and George Sarton, who talk about the Islamic science as being a foundational element to modern science. So regardless of these views, there is this kind of sense of understanding that there was something that happened during the Islamic civilization that was, noticeable, not negligible. And so the question becomes, what attributes to that sudden rise in contributions from a group of peoples who hadn't really previously known to be making immense contributions to civilizational development? And Dr. Jamal Bedawi suggests that it was the Quran and prophetic teachings that kind of generated this new spirit of creativity. And in his book, Water, The Epic Struggle for Wealth, Power, and Civilization, Stephen Solomon talks about this, and that Islam grew through the 9th and 12th centuries extensively throughout various parts of the world, and talks about the fact that they were actually growing in engineering in areas that were vulnerable to changes in terms of hydrological conditions, and called it Islam developing in a water fragile civilization. And more recently, in 2022, there is some research talking about the fact that the first generation of Muslims actually grew and developed in a time that is now being cataloged as a drought, in fact, in Arabia. So not only was it a desert, but at that time, potentially that it was a drought. And so that civilization and the development required water. And there were four, research kind of shows four basic areas that Islamic civilization was developing through, whether it was water sanitation technology, whether it was increasing water supply, whether it was developing water sterilization technology, or just simply innovation and creativity to how to access clean, usable, potable water for many different purposes for the civilization to grow. And Dr. Marwan Haddad, who's a professor of environmental engineering, writes about this. And he talks about the fact that, these water practices were, in fact, extracted from Islamic teachings, that there was a relationship between water supply and faith in Islam, that the Islamic leadership at that time was actually, looking at the, water supply for domestic purposes, irrigation, livestock, whatever it is. The civilizations, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottoman, the research shows that there were distinct water supply development technologies that were that need to be taken into consideration at that time. And he further talks about this ethical framework that Islam has when it comes to, directly to connecting one's faith, behavior, and responsibility to water supply, sanitation, and hygienic considerations. He talks about water management laws, that there are laws around, water wells, how to dig, where to dig, about management of water, in terms of state personal relationships, that there are application codes, that water is in fact treated as a scarce natural resource from an Islamic perspective, and that there are codes of how to in fact engage with this. And so, Dr. Haddad talks about this relationship between the faith and the practices, and what kind of led to that relationship and narrative around water within the Islamic civilization. And so, to put this in a small context, to take just one case, to look at Egypt. And the development of the Islamic civilization in Egypt, again, history shows that there were certain plants that were modified, that modified dietary habits, and there were new species of agricultural products that were introduced into Egypt during the Islamic civilization, such as sorghum, rice, sugarcane, eggplant, citrus fruits, wheats, watermelons, bananas, and these had been acclimatized into Egypt through the introduction of various irrigation practices, botanical knowledge, farming technologies through that period of Islamic civilization, and that they continued well into the 19th century. And then in his book, Rule of Experts, Timothy Mitchell talks about the impact of civilization. And I take this as an example to kind of draw what I'm talking about, that between 1898 and 1902, there was, in fact, the building of a damming system through the Nile of the Aswan. And so what happened was the building of the original barrage at Aswan helped inaugurate uh, this kind of era of engineering and new scale of networks of dams and barrages and canals that moved into the mid 19th century and really converted the country's agricultural practices and introduced what was called year-round irrigation practices. And so then looking at kind of this post-colonial impact, what you also see then was this kind of techno-economic power that starts to come in. And then the further impact is that, where only 1/5 of the Nile Valley was previously being irrigated by the river's annual flood, now there was also, because of the increase of production, there was a requirement of chemical fertilizers. So now chemical fertilizers were being introduced. And by the end of the 30s, so really just 20 years, 25, 30 years after this introduction of the dam, Egyptian farmers were now using 600,000 tons of fertilizer a year. And mostly introduction of new artificial nitrates. At rates that were never being used before. And so the introduction of largely, synthetic chemicals post 1925 starts to happen, and we see an increased output. We see an increased reliance on this technology, whereas previous systems were more self-sustaining without these introductions. Another output that happened here was also prior to the development of that dam, there was a strain of malaria that was contained into Sudan, and the people of Sudan at that time had developed an immunity to that strain. The opening of those dams then enabled travel of that parasite into parts of Egypt, and people who had not had that that immunity were impacted to certain extents, where killing up to 90% of farming communities at that time. And of course, there's so much more to this, the history of what happened here. But the three things that kind of pull out from this, and that I wanted to pull on, was really that what happened slowly was the delegitimization of knowledge systems that previously existed, that impacted the loss of human population as well as species, and a huge change in farming practices and a reliance on chemicals, and the introduction of new problems. And so then Abdul Wahab al-Masiri talks a little bit about this kind of Western penetration of colonialism and these paradigms where the West is really consciously and unconsciously, intentionally and unintentionally forced certain paradigms onto the citizens of the world that advantages the Western world. And so what is that cost on the Islamic narrative, and where the underlying presumption colonization is that the West has become the ultimate point of reference, again, delegitimizing a lot of what was developed in those spaces before. And so the impact now we can see is that there is a pinnacle of global water crisis that is impacting Muslim majority nations. And so these two maps kind of show you. So the darker colors are where there is high water stress on the orange map. And then in the green map, you also can see somewhat of a correlation where the darker green colors are where there are higher concentrations of Muslim populations. And this can further be with further narratives and looking at historically where those colonization practices have impacted these places. Now, based on some of my research, I had engaged in research of Muslim women globally who are engaged in environmental activism, and those of the ones that were involved in works around water-related issues. And from those, that's one group. Another group is conversations with faith-based Islam Muslim community environmental groups who are trying to look at and understand how to address these issues, as well as conversations with Muslim community leaders. What's come out is three kind of suggestions and broad themes that to really move beyond the colonized narrative, there needs to be a deep understanding by Muslims themselves that the water crisis is impacting Muslim majority countries across the world in complex ways. There needs to be a revived zeal and conviction that Muslims are in fact able to respond to this crisis. And there needs to be a commitment from Muslim leaders and scholars to actually prioritize these issues and build relevance within the Muslim community and kind of look back at that historical context of the water narrative as possible means of addressing this crisis. And then at a wider societal level, Ruben Gastambide Fernandez writes about this requirement for authentic solidarity in projects of decolonization, and to really kind of look at how that solidarity, does it stand as being authentically supporting these narratives or not, and having conversations on what it means. And so those are the three suggestions, and along with this fourth, that kind of come broadly from the work that I've been doing. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation and for hosting me. And I look forward to having further conversations and learning through this event. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any questions, again, online or in the room? Pause a moment. Georgine.
I'm going to give it a try.
Okay. Yeah, yes.
It seemed to me like there were different layers of colonization. If I understood you correctly, I'm really asking for clarification. You spoke about natural products that were introduced into the Nile Basin by Muslim civilizations. And then we have the Aswan Dam, and you were speaking about the Western. Do I understand you correctly in that you're saying that there was Islamic colonization first and foremost, and then Western colonization? And so what Muslims need to do in these areas is to recuperate perhaps pre-Islamic practices? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I'm trying to locate you in the room. Sorry, I can't make eye contact. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so there definitely was this growth and this kind of bringing of nutrition and products in areas that previously perhaps didn't have it. And so when I talk about this decolonization, it is a realization or re-realization that there were these methods and solutions and a narrative that guided thriving practices, which have been lost in so many ways now. And so coming back to realizing that, you know, so many of the issues that are impacting so much of the Muslim community now, instead of placing themselves or being put in that place of vulnerability, what does it take to bring back that thriving situation?
Okay, one more question. I'm sorry, Memona, that time is a little short in each
No,
presentation.
no problem at all.
Yes,
It's not so much a question as it is an expression of appreciation for your second point about people being capable of addressing their problems. We've been talking all day about the need for a transformation in relationships and a transformation in the way that we think about ourselves and our interactions with the environment. And so I just really appreciated that insistence that we are capable of dealing with these problems and we don't need to maintain a victim mentality forever. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you for reiterating that. And I think that a lot of my work that I do is around eco-psychology, and that's what I study. And it is very much about our relationships. And we're starting to hear so much of our leaders, so many of our leaders come around starting to say that, because it's not the numbers and statistics that seem to be changing us anyways. And it is that relationship to the earth and to the resources around us, just as we are more inclined to care for our personal relatives more than we may know of somebody on the street that's sick. I think it's that same perspective and so how do we connect? And so for me, I think that Islamic narrative for Muslims, if that is that point of connection, and that where it will deeply impact somebody and peoples and groups to revive, how do we move forward from there?